This is a crank. It connects the pedals to the wheels to make it move. You're offered like 10 different varieties of crank lengths, so how are you supposed to know which one is best for you? The short answer is, with shorter cranks, it's harder to get going and power up hills, but you can probably go faster and sustain that speed for longer durations. Longer cranks are just the opposite. Easier to get going and get up and down hills, but your speed and stamina might be capped. I put a unicycle.com link with more description, but if you'd like to know how we arrived at these answers, I'm going to explain it now. Note that I'm going to talk about actual crank lengths in millimeters a little later in the video. Not only do unicycles get only one wheel, we also only get one gear. There are geared unicycle hubs, but they're the exception to the rule. For our purposes, a gear is just going to be the relationship between how much force you're putting on the pedal and how much the wheel moves. To display this, let's take a seesaw. You can see that if you want to lift a weight on the other side of the seesaw, you have to put equal force on the other side to make it go up. That's because the distance from the fulcrum, or the rotation point, on either side is equal. Torque or moments are a measure of rotational force that is the force applied, essentially the weight, and the distance from the fulcrum. If both sides are equal distance from the fulcrum, then you must apply a force equal to or greater than the force on the opposite side to make it move. But if I'm not feeling strong, I can make the distance on my side twice as long. This means I only need to apply half the force to move the weight, but I have to apply it for twice as long to move the weight the same distance. If I feel extra strong, I can shorten my lever distance to half the original length. I'd have to apply twice the force, but I'll only have to apply it for half as long to move the weight. These ratios apply to every lever distance in between and beyond what we just mentioned too. So what does this mean for our unicycle crank length? Picture our unicycle as a seesaw. The rotation point is the center of the wheel, the lever distance that we apply force to is our crank, and the lever distance of the resistance is the radius of the wheel. If there is a weight at the end of the wheel here, the unicycle acts as a seesaw. The more we shorten the length of the crank, the more force we're going to need to apply to move the wheel and the resistance. But the shorter distance we'll need to apply it for. And this is exactly how wheel rotation works, except the lever distance of the resistance is oriented like this, where the tire meets the ground. The orientation may have changed, but the relationship between force and resistance have not. Now that the basics are out of the way, let's chat about a factor you might want to consider when picking a crank length: your riding experience. Up until now, the resistance we're working with has stayed constant, but when riding, that resistance doesn't. When you're first starting to ride, you have to overcome the unicycles and your own inertia. In other words, the effort to get something to move is more than the effort it takes to get something to keep moving. So when first getting going, it would be nice to have a longer crank arm, so starting off wouldn't be such a burden. But once you're on your way, it would be nice to have a shorter one. If you're a beginner unicyclist that is still working on mounting and short duration riding, it might be more helpful to have a relatively longer crank length because you're probably going to spend more time starting from a standstill than actually riding. But as you progress, you'll probably want shorter crank lengths since you'll be able to pick up a little bit more speed this way. Another factor to consider is terrain. Another way the resistance changes throughout the ride is when you're going up or downhill. When you're riding normally, you just have to fight friction and air resistance and so on. But when going uphill, you also have to fight a bit of gravity that's fighting to make the wheel go down the hill. Additionally, rocky or rough terrain will increase the friction and effort you'll have to overcome to make the wheel move. These are scenarios where you might want longer cranks to overcome the resistance. These longer cranks will also give you more control slowing down when going downhill for the same reason. But you might have brakes for that. If you're expecting to ride on hilly or off-road areas, you might want to consider relatively longer cranks. Now you're probably asking, what is longer versus shorter? Is 102 millimeters short or 150 millimeters long? And the answer has to do with your wheel size, actually. Your wheel size determines the lever length of your resistance. So getting moving on a smaller wheel is much easier than getting going on a bigger wheel because the torque, the force times the distance to the fulcrum, is much less. So you don't need as long of cranks for smaller wheels as you would for bigger wheels. But let's do some math. Let's say you're riding a 20-inch wheel and want to upgrade to a 27.5-inch wheel, but you want to keep the same relative crank length. Go over to your 20-inch and find out how long your cranks are. If you can't see it on the crank itself, just measure in millimeters from the center of the pedal threads to the center of the hole that meets the hub. This is a 125 millimeter crank, but let's come back to your 102 millimeter on your 20-inch example. The relationship between 102 to 20 inches has to be the same to X over 27.5. X will be the crank length you want. So if we do some math, it's 140 millimeters. This would be the same mechanical advantage that you experience on your 20-inch on your new 27.5-inch, with all other things being constant. And you can do this with any wheel size that you're changing to. When I mention relatively shorter or relatively longer, it's relative to this number. So you're upgrading to a 27.5-inch with 140 millimeter cranks, but you're really intending to go faster and not hit a bunch of hills. Plus, you're a more experienced rider now. So maybe you drop down to 125 or 114 millimeter cranks. Or maybe you're hoping to do some mountain riding and expecting to hit a lot of uphills or rocky, rough terrain. Then maybe 140s or even jumping to 150s or 165 millimeter cranks would be helpful. Cranks can vary from 80 millimeters and lower to 170 millimeters and higher. Keep in mind that if you purchase 125s, but you should have gotten 138s, it's not the end of the world. Crank lengths present trade-offs, so just because you should have gotten a shorter or longer crank, it's not going to be drastically different that your whole riding experience is going to be horrid now. One crank size isn't ideal for everything, so you'll just be slightly better at climbing hills and be a tad slower with 138s than you would have with 125s. But you'll still be a lot faster than if you bought 170s. Thank you for sticking to the end with me on this overly detailed explanation. I usually like to know details about why something is what it is, and I would guess you do too if you made it this far. If you're interested in more unicycle content, please consider subscribing and let me know in the comments what crank length you're running, what size wheel you have, and what type of riding you do. I think it'll be helpful for those with questions to see what other people are doing. I hope this video was helpful and best of luck with your crank decision.